The 15th century Middle East was not a land of grand empires. It was a jigsaw puzzle of fractured ambition, a geopolitical powder keg waiting for a single spark. To the west, the Ottoman Sultanate, a relentless, terrifying machine of conquest, was swallowing everything in its path. To the east, the heirs of Tamerlane squabbled over the scraps of a once mighty dominion. In the vast, sun-baked landscape of Persia, there was no central power, only chaos. The great civilizations of antiquity seemed destined to be devoured by Turkish cavalry or lost to petty warlords. This was the storm. Yet, amid this turmoil, a silent revolution was brewing, not in a royal court or an army camp, but in the remote mountain sanctuary of Ardabil. Here, the Safaviya Sufi order, a brotherhood of mystics, had for generations preached a message of piety, justice, and spiritual devotion. They were not statesmen or soldiers. They were dervishes, focused inward, detached from the earthly game of power. They seemed the least likely group to change the course of history, to challenge the Ottoman behemoth, or to forever redraw the religious map of the world. But that is the shocking truth of the Safavid Empire. It was born from a mystic cult. The lineage of the Safavid masters was not merely human to their thousands of fanatically devoted followers. It was seen as blessed, nearly divine. And by the late 15th century, the spiritual mantle fell to a boy named Ismail. His very ancestry was a tapestry of prophecy and bloodshed, tracing back not just to the Sufi saint, Safi ad-Din, but to figures revered by the Shia faith. At the time, Shia Islam was a minority sect across the region, tolerated in some places, but certainly not dominant. The vast majority of the Islamic world was, and is, Sunni, but to Ismail's followers, the Qizilbash, the redheads, who wore distinctive red turbans in his honor, he was the Mahdi, the divinely guided savior. This is where the story shifts from piety to power, from prayer to conquest. How did a tiny, obscure mystic brotherhood, focused on inner enlightenment, transform, in the span of one single generation, into the most feared cavalry force in the world, an army whose war cries would soon echo across the entire Persian plateau? That is the great curiosity of the Safavid story, and it's why understanding it is key to understanding the modern Middle East. The answer lies in the intense, personal, and near-sacred devotion the Qizilbash held for young Ismail. They were not fighting for a patch of land or a tax break. They were fighting for God's chosen representative on earth. This level of zeal is the most potent and terrifying force a ruler can possess, and Ismail was about to unleash it. Before we dive into the impossible conquests of this teenage warlord, consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to Echoes of History. It helps us bring these forgotten, epic stories of civilization to life for thousands more history lovers like you. The stage is set. The old world is crumbling. A 13-year-old boy believes he is a living god, and his army of fanatical redheads is ready to march. The year is 1501. The place is Tabriz. In a moment that would shatter the existing order of the Middle East, the 13-year-old Ismail strode into the city and declared himself Shah of Persia. This was not merely a political claim. It was an act of profound and deliberate religious revolution. With the backing of his terrifyingly loyal Qizilbash, he immediately declared that Twelver Shia Islam, a distinctly minority branch of the faith, would be the mandatory state religion. Imagine the audacity. A mere teenager, having just won a decisive battle against the forces controlling Tabriz, was not content with merely taking a throne. He was fundamentally challenging the theological consensus of 1,000 years, knowing full well this decree was an open, existential declaration of war against the mighty Sunni Ottoman Sultanate to the west and the Uzbek Khans to the northeast. This single decree guaranteed a century of war and bloodshed, and it is the moment modern Iran was truly forged. The Qizilbash, with their signature red caps indicating the 12 imams of Shia Islam, were not just soldiers. They were true believers whose faith made them reckless, ferocious, and seemingly unstoppable. Their battle cry was a prayer, their charge a holy crusade. They believed that no weapon could touch their divinely protected Shah. and in their early campaigns, this conviction gave them a terrifying advantage. Ismail's rise was truly meteoric. It took him barely a decade to sweep away the fragmented successor states of the Timurids and Ak-Koyunlu, uniting the vast and diverse Persian plateau under a single banner for the first time in centuries. He conquered territory from Baghdad to Herat, creating an empire that stretched from the Euphrates to the Oxus. What was the secret to this rapid, shocking success? It was simple: zealotry. The Kizilbash fought with a fervor that professional armies could not match. They saw their leader not as a flawed human king, but as the Murshid-i Kamil, the perfect spiritual guide, a direct descendant of the Prophet's family. They believed they were fighting not just for territory, but for the purification of Islam, and they were willing to die where others might retreat. However, the cost of this religious consolidation was immense. Ismail was ruthless. Sunni scholars were expelled, converted, or executed. Mosques were converted. This systematic imposition of a minority faith, done to create a unique Safavid identity, to unify his disparate tribal army and give his new state legitimacy, was the masterstroke of his reign. But it also put him on a direct, unavoidable collision course with the greatest Islamic power in the world, the Ottomans. The Ottoman Sultan, Selim I, known as Selim the Grim for good reason, viewed Ismail's rise and his religious agenda as an intolerable heresy, a cancer on the body of Islam that threatened the very legitimacy of Ottoman rule. The inevitable conflict was not about borders, it was about the soul of the Islamic world. The stage was set for the colossal, epoch-defining confrontation that would prove to be the ultimate test for the Safavid Empire. The clash that had been inevitable since the declaration of Shia as the state religion finally arrived in 1514 at the Battle of Chaldiran. It was a brutal reckoning that perfectly encapsulates the shift from the medieval battlefield to the early modern one. Sultan Selim marched east with an army that was disciplined, centralized, and equipped with the terrifying new technology of gunpowder, cannons, and muskets. Shah Ismail marched out to meet him with his beloved fanatical Kizilbash cavalry. In Ismail's mind, and the minds of his followers, their divine protection would shield them. The technology of the unbelievers and the Sunnis would be impotent against the will of their holy leader. The belief that spiritual certainty could overcome technological reality was brutally and utterly shattered on the plains of Chaldiran. The Kizilbash charged with their usual, reckless courage, but they were met not with swords, but with an earth-shattering barrage. The Ottoman cannons, chained together for maximum effect, tore horrific gaps in the charging ranks. The disciplined fire of the Janissaries' matchlock muskets mowed down the horsemen who managed to survive the initial cannonade. The battle was a disaster. Thousands of Kizilbash were slaughtered. Shah Ismail himself was nearly captured and had to flee the field. The mighty, new Safavid Empire was defeated. The immediate geopolitical consequences were severe. The Ottomans captured the capital, Tabriz, and took enormous amounts of plunder, including the Shah's favorite wife. More importantly, they secured control over eastern Anatolia, solidifying the long-term border that would define the modern Middle East. But the psychological fallout was even more profound. The defeat was a catastrophic crisis of legitimacy. If the Shah was divinely protected, how could he lose? The loss at Chaldiran forced the Safavids to make a cold, hard choice: evolve or perish. The cult of the Shah, the notion of Ismail as the infallible, divinely guided Messiah, had to be tempered with the reality of statecraft and modern warfare. How did the loss of a single battle force an entire empire to fundamentally rethink its religion, its army, and its fundamental identity just to survive? The answer lay in a painful but necessary process: the slow, grudging adoption of gunpowder technology, and the painful shift from being a militant Sufi order to becoming a functional, bureaucratic Persian empire. The Kizilbash zeal would remain, but from now on, it would be channeled through the institutions of a central government. The messianic fervor had to be harnessed by the mundane necessities of tax collection, supply lines, and diplomacy. The great adventure was over. The hard, grinding work of building a durable civilization had just begun. The death of the charismatic, if flawed, Shah Ismail in 1524 plunged the young empire into a state of near-terminal crisis. His successor, Shah Tahmasp I, was a child of 10. The fervor of the Sizilbash, which had been the Safavids' greatest asset, now became its most debilitating weakness. The tribal chiefs, who viewed themselves as co-founders of the empire, began to use the young Shah as a puppet. The empire dissolved into a labyrinth of internecine strife, a complex web of shifting alliances and bloody power struggles that historians now call the Kizilbash civil wars. The drama wasn't always on the battlefield. Sometimes it was fought silently within the fragile halls of the court. The Kizilbash warlords, arrogant and powerful, carved up the provinces for themselves, openly defying the central government in Tabriz. The Ottoman and Uzbek enemies, smelling blood, launched repeated devastating invasions. The Safavid Empire seemed destined to collapse, not by foreign conquest, but by internal decay. Yet Shah Tahmasp, who would rule for an astonishing 52 years, was a survivor. He grew up navigating the treacherous currents of the court, learning the dark art of political maneuvering. Over time, he slowly and methodically began to play the warlords against each other, using the principle of divide and rule. He was a master of patience, realizing that brute force would only unite his enemies. Tahmasp's first major consolidation came with the painful decision to move the capital from the exposed western city of Tabriz to Qazvin, further inland. This was a strategic retreat, a recognition that the immediate Ottoman military threat was simply too great to resist at the frontier. The new capital of Qazvin became a silent battleground where shahs were often little more than pawns, and the real power was wielded by the warlords. However, it was also the seat from which Tahmasp, with immense subtlety, began to build a non-tribal bureaucracy, staffing it with Persian ulama, clergy, and officials to counterbalance the military might of the Kizilbash chiefs. By the end of his long reign, Tahmasp had stabilized the frontiers and, through the Treaty of Amasya with the Ottomans, gained a much-needed, if temporary, peace. He solidified the borders and, crucially, continued the Safavid mission to institutionalize Twelver Shi'ism, inviting scholars and artisans from across the region. Though his reign lacked the dramatic flair of his father's conquests, it was a necessary period of consolidation. This near collapse under internal pressure set the stage for the empire's single greatest ruler, a man who would not merely stabilize the ship of state, but turn it into a magnificent, unstoppable galleon. To make sure you don't miss the epic climax of this story, the reign of the Shah who built the most spectacular city in the world, please consider subscribing to Echoes of History right now. The late 16th century was a new low point for the Safavid Empire. Shah Tahmasp's weak successors and a renewed Kizilbash free-for-all had left the empire cornered. The Ottomans had seized huge swathes of the west, and the Uzbeks were raiding the east. The Safavids were paying tribute, their armies were in disarray, and the Shahs were effectively prisoners in their own palaces. The man who inherited this broken state was Abbas I, an unlikely hero who would soon earn the title of Shah Abbas the Great. Abbas began his reign in 1588 as a powerless pawn. His first 20 years were a study in pure strategic genius, a demonstration of how a single, brilliant ruler can remake a state from the ground up. His single, most critical move was to break the power of the very men who had put him on the throne, the Kizilbash. He accomplished this through a sweeping, revolutionary military reform. Realizing that the tribal cavalry was loyal only to their own chiefs and not the throne, Shah Abbas created a new standing army, a force modeled loosely on the Ottoman Janissaries. This army was composed primarily of ghulams, slave soldiers, often Christian Circassians, Georgians, and Armenians who had been captured or conscripted. Critically, these ghulams were loyal only to the Shah. They were paid by the central treasury, trained in modern gunpowder warfare, muskets and artillery, and soon became the elite, disciplined core of the Safavid military. This broke the back of the Qizilbash political power and established a centralized professional fighting force. With his new army, Abbas embarked on a series of breathtaking campaigns. He first secured a peace treaty with the Ottomans, though at a significant territorial loss, in a brilliant move to buy time. He then turned his focus east, where he decisively defeated the Uzbeks, securing the vital trade routes of Khorasan. Once the eastern flank was secure, he turned his powerful, modern army west and spent the next decades systematically reclaiming the lost territories from the Ottomans, culminating in the triumphant capture of Baghdad in 1624. Under Shah Abbas, the Safavid Empire reached its territorial zenith and became a geopolitical equal to the Ottoman and Mughal empires. But Abbas's legacy rests as much on bricks and mortar as on blood and conquest. His ultimate vision for the empire was not just survival, but magnificence. In 1598, he moved the capital to Isfahan and began the astonishing project of building the world's most breathtaking city. He was not just building a capital, he was building a statement of Persian grace, power, and cosmopolitanism. How did a young Shah, who started as a powerless pawn, reform an army and build a capital so magnificent it became a global marvel? He did it through relentless centralization, savvy global diplomacy, actively encouraging trade with Europe to bypass the Ottomans, and an iron will to be remembered. His reign was the undisputed golden age of the Safavid Empire. Imagine stepping onto the Naqshi Jahan Square in 17th century Isfahan. It was the heart of the world, and it was deliberately designed to be one. Under Shah Abbas the Great, Isfahan was transformed from a provincial town into a dazzling showpiece that truly earned its Persian nickname, Nisf-e-Jahan, or half of the world. The square itself was no ordinary plaza. It was an enormous open space, larger than any in Europe, serving as a unified stage for the three pillars of the Safavid world: religion, power, and commerce. At one end stood the Masjid-e-Shah, Imam Mosque, a masterpiece of blue-tiled Islamic architecture, demonstrating the piety and devotion of the state. Directly across from it was the Caesarea Bazaar, a colossal two-story gateway leading into miles of covered markets, symbolizing the wealth and commerce that flowed through the empire. On the third side stood the modest but elegant Sheikh Lotfollah Mosque, built for the Shah's private use and the women of the court, a demonstration of subtle refinement. Finally, the Ali Kapu Palace, with its commanding balcony, was the seat of royal power, from which the Shah would observe polo games and military parades. The contrast between the early, militant zeal of the Qizilbash and the later, cosmopolitan artistry of Isfahan is one of the most fascinating transformations in history. This was an empire that had learned to channel its immense spiritual energy into artistic and intellectual output. The wealth that fueled this explosion of culture came primarily from the global silk trade. Shah Abbas consolidated the production and distribution of Persian silk, establishing a royal monopoly. This precious commodity flowed west to Europe, east to India, and north to Russia, making the Safavids an indispensable player in global commerce. European merchants, diplomats, and adventurers flocked to Isfahan, creating an international city whose Armenian, European, and Indian quarters thrived. What was it like to walk the streets of 17th century Isfahan, a city that was literally designed to showcase the power and grace of God? It was an experience of color, sound, and scent unmatched anywhere else. The blue and yellow tiles of the mosques shimmered in the desert sun. The air was filled with the aroma of spices and the sound of 1,000 tongues bartering in the bazaar. This was the pinnacle of Persian civilization, a truly golden age. This kind of intense cultural transformation and economic power is not accidental. It requires a stable foundation. If you're learning something new about this incredible era, please do us a favor and hit the comment section and let us know what you think the most surprising fact about the Safavid Empire is. The history of empires is a tragic poem. The greater the peak, the swifter and more devastating the fall often appears. For the Safavid Empire, the seeds of internal decay were already sown in the spectacular architecture of Isfahan. The primary cause of the decline was the chilling phenomenon known as the harem policy. Fearing the military threat of capable sons, Shah Abbas I adopted a practice of cloistering potential heirs in the royal harem, denying them any meaningful education in governance, military command, or court politics. The result was a succession of weak, inexperienced, and often easily manipulated rulers, men who were more comfortable with luxury than with the harsh realities of statecraft. Under these weak successors, power gradually drifted away from the Shah and into two competing centers: the increasingly bureaucratic court officials and, more ominously, the powerful Shia clergy, the ulama. The clergy, empowered by the Shah's official support for their faith, began to challenge the secular authority of the throne, demanding strict adherence to religious law and turning against the cosmopolitan tolerance that had defined Shah Abbas's reign. This rise of the ulama created an internal conservatism that stifled the innovation and energy that had once defined the empire. The military machine also rusted. The expensive Ghulam army was neglected. The central administration grew corrupt, and the frontiers began to fray. The great power that could humble the Ottomans now struggled to collect taxes from its own provinces. The final, catastrophic blow came not from the external enemies like the Ottomans or the Mughals, but from a seemingly minor rebellion from within its own borders. The eastern province of Kandahar was lost to the Mughals, but the most devastating blow came from Afghanistan. In 1722, a force of Afghan Hotaki rebels, under Mir Mahmud Hotaki, marched on the magnificent capital of Isfahan. The ensuing siege of Isfahan was a slow, agonizing death. The Safavid court, paralyzed by incompetence and indecision, failed to properly manage the city's defense or its vast food stores. The siege lasted 8 months and ended not with a glorious battle, but with starvation and surrender. The once great Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, was forced to abdicate to the Afghan warlord. How could an empire so powerful, so culturally rich, fall not to its eternal enemies, but to a seemingly minor rebellion from within its own borders? The answer is simple. The strength of the foundation had been sacrificed for the glory of the facade. The dynasty officially ended in 1736, but its legacy is immense and enduring. The Safavid Empire fundamentally and irreversibly shaped the identity of modern Iran. They were the architects of a unique, powerful, and deeply entrenched Shia identity that distinguishes Iran geopolitically and culturally to this day. They left behind a Persian civilization defined by stunning artistry, architectural genius, and a resilient national consciousness. The echoes of their history resonate in the very fabric of the modern world.